and I have Mr. McLean up for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome everybody. Mr. Aurora, thanks very much for appearing here today. It's a pleasure to meet you this way. But when Justin Trudeau took power 6 years ago, the typical home price was $434,500 in Canada. Now that price of that typical family home in Canada is $811,700. That's 85% inflation in 6 years. And last year, home inflation hit 25%, which an economist from the Canadian Real Estate Association called the biggest gain of all time. That followed $400 billion of newly created cash the government pumped into financial markets. Much of it lent out to risky variable mortgages at interest rates well below inflation, expected inflation, but well below actual inflation, as you're seeing. These negative rates literally pay people to borrow and bid up prices. But banks look at the cost of home ownership by looking at total home ownership costs as a percentage of income. And it's usually between 25 and 40%. With taxes on housing rising and inflation on the required repairs rising, the percentage of a median family income dedicated to housing is obviously rising. At the end of 2021, National Bank of Canada calculated that percentage at 60%. Remember, banks usually look at the median being around 25 to 40% where they can lend. Is that 60% of median family income required for housing considered in StatsCan's inflation calculations?
Thank you for that question. So the way that we come at is we do an annual survey of, what is the typical consumption, of the Canadian household. And that then gets used to weight components of the CPI. And we do this now on an annual basis, and the last one showed, no question, that the shelter costs make up about 30%, if you like, of that weight of that basket. And as I mentioned earlier, that has, various subcomponents, the household operations, furnishing and equipment, which is about just under 15%. We talked earlier about the replacement component, and so on. So, and then, of course, we do have other measures where we look at, compared to the median income of a particular household, at what point, do those basic costs then, put them in, either in core housing needs, if you like. So when those costs increase above that rate, well, then we deem that household and every member within that household to be in core housing need. And that last figure that we have was about 10% of Canadians households were in that position where it was felt that they were, spending a disproportionately high portion of their income towards shelter costs compared to what income that they're
so
getting.
my takeaway from the response so far is that National Bank says it's 60% of median income required for shelter in Canada right now, and you have it calculated in your inflation calculation at 30%. Is that the difference between what the banks are seeing as far as the cost of shelter and what you're calculating as the cost of shelter?
Well, again, I can speak to how we do it. And so ours is a very stable, rigorous approach over time where we go and survey, tens of thousands of households and find out, what are they spending, their income on in a typical month, down to a very, very small differential between what they take in and what they spend. And then that forms the basis, if you like, of the weight within the CPI. And then we measure that change in that expenditure over time to come at the index.
So in arriving at our current inflation rate, you're still minimizing the amount of household income that would be allocated towards shelter because it's part of a long-term trend, and you're not going to pay attention to the blips that are happening that may be short-term, much like transitory inflation might be short-term. Is this correct?
Well, look, so there are two concepts here. One is, how do we measure that change, that change in that basket, as exemplified by that typical expenditure And so it just says, look, in terms of shelter costs, we're talking about an average household spending about 30% on that. That serves as the weight in the basket. And then when you see that change over time, year over year, that's gone up 4.8%. I think I've talked earlier about the different components of what that means. This whole notion of, as a percentage of, the income and a household type, that's a separate measure. And that's where I was going at in terms of the core housing needs. We do measure that.